The German Expressionist movement of the 1920s is arguably the most influential movement within the silent era of cinema. These dark and brooding films were often characterized by emotive set designs, over-the-top acting choices, as well as the dramatic lighting technique known as chiaroscuro. These visual qualities of German Expressionism also tended to mirror the inner turmoils of its characters. As the Nazi Party rose to power in the late 1920s, many of these same German Expressionist filmmakers immigrated to the US, bringing their creative influence to Hollywood. For instance, the Universal Studios horror classics of the 1930s, films like Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy, directly benefited from the creative techniques established by German Expressionist films like Nosferatu, The Golem, and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The use of distinct camera angles and high-contrast lighting techniques also worked their way into the film noir genre of the 1940s. Even today, the style of this movement continues to have influence on the visual language of modern cinema. In this video series, I plan to delve into the complex and rich history behind these concepts and explore how they've influenced the making of Star Wars. In this particular video, we'll focus on the immediate history of World War I, its impact on the German film industry, as well as how it relates to the development of Star Wars. In subsequent videos, we'll examine some of the key creative elements behind the German Expressionist movement, including the lighting technique of chiaroscuro, the animating quality of expressionistic production design, as well as the intriguing German cultural mindset, which played a unique role in this definitive movement in cinema's history. To begin, let's lay the groundwork for the First World War. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, presumably by forces working within the Serbian government. The Austrian-Hungary Empire is reeling for war in the Balkans. A surge of imperialism across Europe, particularly within Germany in the decades prior, coupled with the border insecurities between the two major geographical alliances, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, and the Triple Entente of the UK, France, and Russia, drives Europe into a political crisis that would escalate into an all-out continental war. Germany's film industry before the war was rather small and simple in scope, with its meager domestic output largely being made up of comedies and melodramas. During the initial years of the conflict, short war films and frontline footage were also shown in German theaters, though they were met with little public interest. In an attempt to counter the developing film propaganda machine of the Entente, the German government imposed a foreign film embargo in 1916, with future plans to establish its own pro-German film company. With fewer foreign films being shown in German theaters, new production companies emerged, with over 130 newly established by the war's end. In December of 1917, the largest production companies in Germany were then consolidated into a single state-sanctioned entity known as Universum Film AG, or UFA for short. However, the Germans would lose the war a mere 11 months later, and the pro-German UFA, along with many other studios, shifted their focus towards recovering lost revenue. In an effort to bank on the enduring popularity of Expressionism within Germany, many of these studios chose to incorporate Expressionist artists into their post-war films. It's at this point that Germany finally began to make its creative mark within the world of filmmaking. Kicking off the German Expressionist movement was 1920's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a film famous for its oblique and sketched-on set designs. The film's fictional small town of Hostemol was created by two expressionist painters turned production designers, Walter Rohrig and Walter Reimann. Despite the otherwise flat appearance of an old medieval town painted onto a series of blank canvases, the film's scenery was still able to do something inherently expressionistic. It reflected the maddened subjectivity of the film's characters. The lighting follows suit, creating emotional expressions of danger and isolation within the world's shadows and silhouettes. Even the acting took on an expressionistic form, with Werner Krauss and Conrad Veidt's performances echoing the twisted shapes of the world around them, creating symbolic expressions of violence throughout the narrative. Importantly, this synergistic relationship provided a much-needed cathartic release for the German people. The haunted memories of soldiers and civilians lost in the preceding years cast a dark shadow over what would be known as the Weimar period of Germany's republic. Persistent famines, massive war debts, and unmanageable hyperinflation devastated the German people. The lost dream of an empire, which began back in 1871 with Germany's unification, was also a major psychological shock. While the country tried to rebuild itself, a series of political coups, revolts, and street violence created an air of tension that hung over the nation's future. This social and economic strife was then topped off by the crushing war reparations of the Versailles Treaty in 1920. All of this left little hope for the German people's future. It's no wonder the resulting films often reflect this morbid atmosphere. This overwhelming disillusionment seeped into Dr. Caligari's narrative as well. The writers Karl Mayr and Hans Janowitz were themselves made pacifists by the grim realities of the Great War, and their original script was meant to be a condemnation of the absurdity of authoritarianism as embodied in the film's titular character. In the film, the hypnotist Dr. Caligari forces his sleepwalking assistant, Cesare, into a series of murders throughout the town. This was meant as a metaphor for the young German soldiers who were sent to kill in a war dictated by an asocial ruling class. However, the writer's intentions were ultimately sullied by a tacked-on prologue and epilogue, which reduced the narratives to the ravings of a madman. At the time, the production company assumed that this would be a more popular narrative device, which in turn would generate more revenue. Much has been said about this curious anecdote from the film's production. The film theorist Siegfried Kracauer wrote about this in his 1947 book titled From Caligari to Hitler, which links this apolitical and escapist desire within the Weimar period's film industry to the rise of the Nazi Party in the late 1920s. It's notable that Krakauer's book was written when the devastation of war echoed through the war-torn streets of then popular Italian neorealist films, 2 decades after the German Expressionist movement ended in 1927. The Nazi Party in the 1930s had deemed all modern art, including expressionist works within film, as degenerate and would either censor these works or destroy them completely. While one can argue that escapism and apolitical statements within film have their own political effect, I still resist the idea that film should be reduced to a mere propagandist lens, even if it serves a noble cause. While the Expressionists once called themselves apocalyptic adolescents and have been criticized as rebels without a cause, the German Expressionists have nevertheless been quite influential across cinema's history. Alfred Hitchcock, Orson Welles, Stanley Kubrick, Ridley Scott, Tim Burton, Lars von Trier, Alex Provost, David Lynch, Robert Rodriguez, Guillermo del Toro, Joe Cohen, Robert Eggers, and George Lucas? Well, the answer to that is it depends. In a 2015 interview with James Cameron, George Lucas remarked that one of his visual goals for Star Wars was to create what Akira Kurosawa called an immaculate reality. The aim of an authentic, lived-in world for the original trilogy naturally aligns itself more closely with the realism of post-World War II Italy than with the warped subjectivity of the German Expressionists. The Vietnam War's impact on the narrative of Star Wars also aligns itself with the political sentiment of the Italian neorealists. And yet, remnants of German Expressionism still find their way into the Star Wars films in interesting ways. I plan to explore those further in future videos, but for now, I'll focus on the historical perspective of Star Wars' development and how it relates to the German film industry of the Weimar period. While you could say that the Great War amplified the warped visions of the German Expressionists, and the Second World War showcased its own destructive powers through the ruined streets of Italian neorealism, the Vietnam War, in tandem with the counterculture movement of the 1960s, generated a kind of narrative cynicism that pervaded many American films of the 1960s and 70s. It's worth noting that key industry changes in the Hollywood studio system, including the rise of television in the 1950s, the antitrust laws imposed on the studio system in 1948, as well as the breakdown of the Motion Picture Production Code in 1966, catalyzed this shift. The chaotic downfall of the studio system allowed many younger directors to take unprecedented creative control of their films, with little oversight from their newly established producers. The renowned producer Roger Corman, for instance, hired experimental young directors like Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola to inject new life into the silver screen. These filmmakers were directly influenced by the Asian and European art films that gained popularity on college campuses after World War II. This period of American filmmaking is often referred to as the New Hollywood. Themes of political corruption, government surveillance, media sensationalism, and anti-authoritarianism were all inspired by this cultural political shift within American society. A younger and more experimental George Lucas directly benefited from this shift in Hollywood's production. His unconventional student film titled Electronic Labyrinth THX 1138-4EB earned him an internship at Warner Brothers in 1967. There, he was mentored by the up-and-coming director Francis Ford Coppola, who was then working on his film Finian's Rainbow. Coppola and Lucas became fast friends on set, bonding over their shared love of beards and sensibilities as filmmakers. Shortly after production finished, Coppola and Lucas decided to establish their own production company called American Zoetrope in 1969. And that's where things get interesting. George and his friend John Milius pitched an idea to Coppola for an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, set during the Vietnam War. The film would be titled Apocalypse Now, with John Milius set to write and George set to direct. Coppola seemingly learned much about the Vietnam War from George and, in particular, John Milius, who had friends directly involved in the war. It wasn't until many years later, after George Lucas became predisposed with his Star Wars trilogy, that Coppola decided to take on the project himself. Now, none of this would have occurred if Coppola hadn't egged on the more experimentally inclined George to go out and make a classic Hollywood-style film. The duo needed another big hit like Coppola's The Godfather in order to continue funding their more experimental works. After all, it was George's theatrical cut of THX 1138 which had almost bankrupted American Zoetrope in the year prior. So, George took Coppola up on his bet, and he went out to make the pop culture hit American Graffiti the following year. The film's success then snowballed into a 3-picture deal for Star Wars, thus sidelining George's original plans to direct his anti-war version of Apocalypse Now. After several setbacks in production, Coppola's version of Apocalypse Now would be released in 1979. Coppola himself didn't view his version of Apocalypse Now as directly political in nature. Instead, it was, quote, about war and the human soul. Coppola's Apocalypse Now was meant to be a pursuit of the eternal truths behind humanity and war itself, rather than a political statement about America's involvement in the war. I think in many ways, this overarching story mirrors the anecdote behind the production for The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Dr. Caligari became an escapist, apolitical film despite the intentions of its writers out of a need for its financial success. Similarly, Coppola and Lucas needed to make a big hit film after the failure of THX 1138 in order to fund their future experimental works. This came at the cost of George's ability to weave his own anti-war sentiment into his version of Apocalypse Now, and the version we got was essentially apolitical in nature, despite reaching for those deeper truths. I think Coppola's story in particular captures that essence of apocalyptic adolescence, which defined the Expressionists before him. The story of Star Wars, however, is a bit different. While the success of American Graffiti prevented George from directing his more politically ambitious project, he still drew inspiration from the Vietnam War when developing Star Wars. Without producers limiting its concept or the cynicism of New Hollywood weighing down its story, Star Wars was able to straddle the line between German Expressionist escapism and Italian neorealist anti-war sentiment. Whether this meant that Star Wars killed the New Hollywood or was in fact its greatest achievement is definitely up for debate. In either case, the rebellious creativity of Star Wars, much like the works of the German Expressionists before it, will likely continue to influence cinema for decades to come. And that's it for this very brief introduction to the historical backdrop of German Expressionism. If you like this video, leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more film theory and Star Wars content. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.
When we were starting, he was a sweet young droid and very anxious to please. He'd go and get you coffee or something. We actually tried to get him, R2-D2, in The Godfather.
If I remember correctly, he wanted him for the Michael Corleone role.
Since I read the book, I mean, I could just see him in those scenes when he's walking through the Sicilian countryside with the 2 bodyguards with their shotguns. And so kind of that image always made me persist in trying to get him the part, but they didn't see it. Bob Evans called him a runt.